Welcome to Conversations That Matter. You know, Mike, fisheries was one of the main industries in British Columbia. We don't hear about it very often. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about our guest and their perspective on where we're at when it comes to fisheries in the oceans here off the coast of British Columbia.
Yeah, you're right, Stu. We don't hear a lot about fisheries, and it's still worth a couple $2 billion a year today in economic activity. And think about coastal communities and First Nations, they really depend on fisheries. Jim McIsaac is actually a commercial fisherman, and he's involved in a number of processes that are going on along the west coast of Canada to ensure that our fisheries are sustainable and that all of the key stakeholders are involved in making decisions. So bringing together commercial fishermen, recreational, First Nations, as well as government, and trying to get on the same sheet of music to determine how we access these very limited and important resources.
And there's challenges in getting all of those different interests together, aren't there?
Well, absolutely, and a lot of it has to do with years and years of history, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that our world has changed and our understanding of the value of resources like fisheries has evolved. And we really have a much more refined and laser focus now on making sure that we sustain these resources for the future. And that oftentimes means limiting access. And within that whole concept of limiting access, whether it's for environmental purposes or to respect First Nation rights, lots of interests that get tangled up and need to be heard.
But that's challenging to do because the demand on the fisheries as a food source continues to increase as more and more people are consuming fish, and a lot of people are doing it for health reasons.
No, that's absolutely right, and of course we have the controversy in British Columbia of aquaculture, farming fish. So it's a big issue. It's one that Jim McIsaac's been involved with for many, many years, and he has a very positive attitude about the future, that if we keep bringing people to the table, again, the First Nations, recreational, commercial, as well as the government voices, that if we keep at it, we really can make sure that everyone gets what they need and that we sustain the resources for the future.
Well, we'll be back with that conversation with Mr. McIsaac in just a moment. Welcome. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you wind up being on the sustainability side of the equation around fisheries and habitat?
You know, when I was a teenager, I got involved in, one of my best friends was, his father owned a few fish boats, and so I got involved in the fisheries in high school. When I graduated from high school, it paid my way through university. I loved commercial fishing, so I was up and down the coast.
What size of vessel were you on?
A variety of different vessels. So from small gillnet vessels to large seine vessels and everything in between.
You know the coast. So
I've been up and down the coast.
Yeah.
When I graduated from university, I was given a number of options. Through the university, they offered me some research positions. I studied philosophy and physics, mathematics. I was immersed in kind of understanding the world around me. The decision I made when I graduated was to stay in the fishing industry because I loved it. I loved the people. I loved the coast. I wanted to be real and be part of life today and changing it for.
You've now graduated from university with what kind of degree?
I have a degree in science.
Related to oceans and fisheries?
No. Mathematics and physics.
Mathematics and physics.
Correct.
But you come back to the ocean, to the fish. How come?
You know, the people that I met on the coast, they're just incredible people. The people that I fished with, very passionate and real and grounded in the water and in the resource and in their communities. So I grew up, and developed that passion for fisheries. So what really, I was in the process of buying a boat in '96 when the kind of ceiling came down on the salmon fishery. There was a major restructuring of it. And so it kind of threw my business plan for fisheries out the window. And at the same time, the fishery had collapsed. There was no restructuring plan in place by the federal government for what was coming down. And I had people calling me and saying, you know, we have no money for our family, and you know, I'm losing my boat and my house and everything. So I was part of a group that negotiated with the federal government around a restructuring package. The kind of cost that we seen in that was you know, somewhere in the order of $1 billion, and they ended up coming out with about 18 months later a $1.5 billion program for restructuring the fishery. And still, even at that, there was a lot of people that were left behind, a lot of communities that were left behind. The way that they restructured the industry has been problematic for most of the communities on the coast as well. So it's disconnected the communities from fisheries moving forward. So that's, you know, that kind of period took me for about 5 years working as in that restructuring, and then I got involved with the T. Buck Suzuki Foundation and the Director of Sustainability inside the foundation. So one of the key areas that I work in is sustainable fisheries, and one of the aspects that was identified as kind of where our fisheries were lacking was integration. We have our fisheries have gone through some major restructuring over the last 20-25 years, and the integration part was one that was kind of globally identified as one of the weaknesses in Canadian fisheries.
So from your perspective, we're not, as a society, especially here in British Columbia, that was so heavily reliant on fisheries at one point in our history. We're hardly paying any attention to it at all, especially if you open up the pages of the newspapers or watch local news. So therefore, we don't really know what state the fisheries are in. What state are they in?
The state of fisheries, I would say in a kind of the biological sense, the fisheries here are really healthy. We have 22 different types of fisheries on the coast, and they're managed on the biological side very conservatively. They're certainly the focus since the collapse of the Claude in Atlantic Canada has been precautionary to the extreme. That's how I would characterize the fisheries as they've developed here.
So is that a success story, or from your perspective, or were we too cautious?
There's more than just the biological fisheries. Fisheries are socioeconomic activity. So fisheries are, Canada argued in the development of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, that we should have a larger marine territory to protect the access for adjacent communities and for fishermen, against roving fishing fleets on the planet. To protect that, on Atlantic Canada, they do a really good job of protecting that local access.
Off the Grand Banks.
Off the Grand Banks, and for the communities that are there. The provinces there really fight for their small rural coastal communities to have access to fisheries. On our coast, what has happened with the restructuring of the various fisheries, it's all been centralized, and it's created some efficiencies in the industry, but it's disconnected a lot of communities. So you have the communities where they're watching a fishery right on their doorstep and have no connection to it. So in that sense, the fisheries are not healthy, but on the biological side, they are healthy.
So as far as the biological side is concerned, you believe it's healthy enough to be a food source that is not only supplying nourishment to people, but also supplying economic opportunity to so many communities up and down the coast.
Correct, definitely, yes.
So what do we do to change it? How do we get it back to a place where we are managing the seas in a way that we're not devastating the biological side, which had been the concern, but we also allow for the human side of this to be in balance.
That's it's very complicated. We have management from afar, from Ottawa. Very hard to influence, their decisions around fisheries policy here. The province has really shied away from taking a role in that and speaking up for the communities around the coast. I think the First Nations on the coast, they've expressed time and time again that they want to be, fully connected with fisheries, and they're not. The federal government has a number of programs to try and, bring them into existing fisheries and the existing structure of fisheries, but it's a very slow kind of process that they're entering into. It's there's a fundamental inequity for those communities, and if it's extended, if they take 50 years to get to kind of an equity point, that's an injustice in itself.
What do you think the economic loss is right now that we're experiencing as a result of this depletion in fishing activity on the coast? Like, how many jobs? What's the amount of revenue?
That's a good question. We did a study on the socioeconomic value of fisheries to communities, and found that there's the tangible, the economic values that are really obvious, but we found that the intangible values exceed that, and so the value that's being lost into the communities on the coast with that disconnect is huge. We have a fishery that a landed value in the $300 million range, a retail value of $900 million, something thereabouts on our coast. We have this.
That's what we're experiencing right now.
Right now, yes.
But you say it's only a portion of what it could be.
The benefit to the communities, like to Vancouver. If Vancouver is the community that's reaping all of the benefit, the socioeconomic benefit, it's a drop in the bucket for the economy here. But for a small community like, say, Masset or Queen Charlotte City or Bellacoola or Sontula or Port Hardy, it's huge. It's a major component of their economy, and that connection to the sea, having people who are in the community, who are out there with their hand in the water and watching what's going on and observing and being part of that and connecting the community to the ecosystem and to the food that's on their doorstep is a huge connection for small communities. And that's the connection, that's the value that's being lost.
So from your perspective, what's the first thing that we have to do to start making some changes so that it balances out appropriately?
Well, I think the larger frame for fisheries, I think we need to deal with the social issues, make sure that we're dealing equitably with the communities on the coast. That is a fundamental piece, and allowing First Nations and rural coastal communities to play a significant role in decision-making of fisheries going forward, I think would have a huge impact on fisheries here. That's not to say that the folks that are in fisheries should just be cut off or anything like that. I mean, you have to deal equitably with that kind of change as well.
Do you think that there's been too much concentration of power then by some of the fishing companies, that it drives everything back to Vancouver and removes some of those local communities?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that there's been concentration in fisheries over the last 25, 30 years. The last study that was done on it at the beginning of last year identified, kind of researching all the licensing, identified as a key issue is the continued concentration of the fishery and getting any kind of data on what's going on. So yeah, that is That's fact that's out there.
So how does the federal government then start to relax maybe some of the constraints that are put on individual fishermen, such as yourself, going back to 1996, where you're looking to buy licenses, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, this is too onerous. I can't afford all of that. Mm-hmm. Do they need to sort of let go of the reins a little bit and let it move back to the point where you can have multi-jurisdictional licenses?
Well, so one of the fundamental policies that they have in Atlantic Canada is called the policy to preserve the inshore independent fleet, PIFCAF. And so that policy, all 5 Atlantic provinces support that policy. And basically that policy protects the independent small boat owner from the large corporations. Mm-hmm. So it allows them to be in that realm and to have an ownership in fisheries where they're not competing against global players. We don't have that same policy. Even though we're in Canada, we don't have the same policy here in British Columbia. So
yeah, we have centralized management, but we don't have that policy here.
We don't have, and it's a fundamental, it's a key policy. It's the policy that the fishermen on the Atlantic Canada put incredible value on. It's the real, one of the pillars of their existence. Why they're the largest private sector employer in Atlantic Canada is because of that policy. It allows them to be.
In our heyday, how many people were working within the fishing industry in British Columbia, and how many do we have today?
Well, in '92, we had 21,000 fishermen. Fishermen on our coast. Today we have about 5,400, so about a quarter of the size.
And when you extend that out to people who were handling that catch on shore, how many people were involved then versus today?
That's a good question. I don't know the actual shore numbers then. The shore numbers now, it's around 5,000 as well. So it might be comparable back then.
You go out to Steveston, you go up to places like Beaver Cove on Vancouver Island, where there were canneries that don't exist any longer. Like one after another, they've just disappeared, and yet they were so much of the lifeblood of this province. Do you think that we can turn it around?
I think we can turn the fisheries around, the connection of fisheries to communities around. Whether we'll see, a cannery in every bay along our coast, I don't think that's the future. But I think we could be landing fish in way more communities than we are now, and have a distribution network to markets that connects all these communities. I think that's entirely possible.
What sort of support do you need from the public to help you to be able to move this in a direction that allows for that to happen?
That's a good question.
Because I can't help but think, okay, I watch a number of people who are concerned about the wild stock. I'd rather eat wild fish, yet they're not necessarily ensuring that the fishery itself can be healthy so they can actually get that fish.
Mm-hmm. So I think letting your provincial government know that it's important to be playing a role in fisheries would be a positive step. Certainly talking to your MPs about the connection of fisheries to rural coastal communities is very important. Dealing equitably with First Nations on fisheries issues to the federal government. I think that's one of the critical things moving forward in reconnecting communities on this coast to fisheries.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed that that we can see that boat turning a little bit, and that.
So one of the areas that I've worked in over the last 4 or 5 years is integrated planning. And so that's the, where you have the governments in the room You have all of the different sectors that are working on the marine environment in the room. You have conservationists, recreational users, tourism operators, that kind of thing, and building a plan of how the ocean should be managed. And so the federal government led the larger process on that, the PENSEMA process, and then re-scoped it to take out, really the detailed planning that was, envisioned initially. So the province and First Nations stepped up and took that on themselves, without the federal government in the room, without their jurisdiction in the room. And so over the last 2 years, they've built a set of plans to try and, change how our oceans are managed, keeping it inside of provincial jurisdiction. And provincial government actually has much more jurisdiction than they're kind of exercising on the marine environment.
It's just a question of whether or not they exercise it.
Whether they're willing to exercise it and put the resources in to exercise that as well. They've gone through this planning process over the last 2 years. They've just finalized 4 sub-regional plans in the North Coast. Those plans, they speak out 20, 50 years into the future and painting a different vision and a different connection with communities and decision-making on the coast.
They'll shape the future of those communities.
Help shape the future of those communities. The federal government absence in those plans is very noticeable. And as as a Canadian, I'm really disappointed that the federal government hasn't stepped up, especially when they have something like the Oceans Act that tasks them to lead in that kind of integrated process, and they're not doing it.
Well, let's remain optimistic and hope that we can see a bit of a resurgence within the fishing sector here in British Columbia, because it has been such a part of our history, and it would be a shame to lose that. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.